Introduction. Why won't the dead stay dead? One thing terrified our ancestors more than death itself: the possibility that a dead person might not be completely dead, that a corpse might wake up, that a spirit might linger, that the buried might claw their way back to the surface. Long before Bram Stoker's Count Dracula swept through Victorian London, before Gothic novels made monsters romantic, even before the word vampire entered the English language, humans across the world told stories about the dead who refused to stay dead. From those stories came the vampire, a creature that survives by consuming the life force of others, caught forever between the grave and the heartbeat. No myth has proven more adaptable, more intimate, or more enduring. The vampire has been demon and lover, corpse and aristocrat, plague and dream. Its forms shift with each generation. One century's bloated peasant corpse becomes another's seductive nobleman, then a tortured romantic hero, then a glittering teenager navigating high school. Yet beneath these transformations, something essential persists. The vampire drinks life to preserve its own, and in doing so it shows us truths about ourselves we might otherwise avoid. Why the vampire endures. What makes the vampire unique among monsters is its uncomfortable proximity to humanity. Ghosts are ethereal, werewolves transform into beasts, demons come from hell, but vampires remain recognizably human, even as they commit inhuman acts. They walk upright, speak our languages, wear our clothes. They remember being human. They often were human once before something transformed them into predators. This nearness makes them both more intimate and more disturbing than purely supernatural beings. When we imagine vampires, we imagine ourselves, our bodies, our desires, our mortality, just twisted into something that feeds on others to survive. The vampire also embodies a fundamental paradox of human experience: the yearning for eternal life coupled with the knowledge that immortality might be curse rather than blessing. We fear death but fantasize about escaping it. The vampire offers that escape and then shows us the price. Immortality means watching everyone you love die. It means accumulating loss across centuries. It means sustaining yourself by draining others. It means existing outside the human community, fundamentally alone. The vampire reminds us that conquering death might not solve our problems. It might only make them eternal. Perhaps most importantly, the vampire is endlessly flexible. It can represent whatever frightens or fascinates us most intensely. In medieval villages, vampires embody the terror of epidemic disease spreading through families. In Victorian England, they represented anxieties about sexuality, immigration, and the corruption of innocence. In 20th century America, they became metaphors for AIDS, for queer identity, for predatory capitalism, for toxic relationships. Today, they represent everything from climate catastrophe to digital surveillance to the loneliness epidemic. The vampire adapts to each era's concerns while remaining recognizable, which is why it has outlasted nearly every other monster in human mythology. The journey ahead. This book traces the vampire's remarkable evolution from ancient folklore to global pop culture phenomenon. We begin in the soil, literally, in the graves and burial grounds where the vampire myth was born. In ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, China, and India, people told stories about restless spirits that fed on the living. These weren't entertainment. They were attempts to explain why disease spread through families, why some bodies didn't decay normally, why death seemed to radiate outward from specific corpses. Medieval and early modern Europe transformed these beliefs into elaborate systems of protection and destruction. Villages in the Balkans and Slavic lands developed detailed protocols: how to identify a vampire, exhume the body and check for signs of unnatural preservation, how to neutralize it, stake through the heart, decapitation, burning, how to prevent people from becoming vampires in the first place, proper burial, religious rites, garlic, and crosses. These weren't superstitions, but rational responses to genuine patterns. Disease did spread through households. Bodies did appear to move and bleed after burial. The explanations were wrong, but the observations were accurate. The 18th century brought conflict. The church struggled with vampire beliefs that complicated Christian theology. Enlightenment scientists tried to explain vampire phenomena through natural causes, while Enlightenment philosophers dismissed the whole thing as peasant ignorance. Yet official reports of vampire exhumations continued to circulate, documented by military officers and clergy, creating a paradox. How could educated Europeans be witnessing and recording events that reason said were impossible? Literature resolved this paradox by transforming the vampire from supposedly reality into acknowledged fiction. The Gothic novel domesticated the vampire, made it safe for educated consumption. John Polidori's aristocratic Lord Ruthven, Sheridan Le Fanu's seductive Camilla, and eventually Bram Stoker's Count Dracula transplanted the vampire from Eastern European villages into drawing rooms and Gothic castles. These literary vampires retained the folk creature's essential characteristics, the feeding, the transformation, the immortality, but gained psychological complexity, moral ambiguity, and erotic charge. The vampire became a character rather than just a threat. Cinema gave the vampire a face. F.W. Murnau's rat-like Nosferatu, Bela Lugosi's hypnotic Dracula, Christopher Lee's feral Count. These performances created visual templates that would define vampires for generations. Film made the vampire immediate and visceral in ways literature couldn't, but it also made the vampire specific in ways that constrained imagination. The cinematic vampire had to look like something, move in particular ways, exist in concrete spaces. This trade-off, immediacy for ambiguity, would shape how audiences understood vampires throughout the 20th century. Television and late 20th century literature brought the most radical transformation. The vampire became the protagonist of its own story. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire let the monster speak for itself, expressing loneliness, moral conflict, and philosophical questioning. Television shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer made vampires weekly visitors, both threats and complex characters. The Twilight phenomenon turned vampires into romantic heroes for teenage audiences. The vampire evolved from villain to anti-hero to love interest, from monster to metaphor for adolescent angst and identity crisis. Throughout this evolution, the vampire has functioned as mirror, reflecting each era's deepest fears and most compelling fantasies. We'll examine how vampires represent capitalism, the parasitic aristocrat draining others' vitality, disease, spreading through intimate contact, transforming victims into vectors, sexuality, the penetrating bite, the exchange of fluids, desire that violates boundaries, immigration, the foreign invader contaminating native purity, power, those who sustain themselves by consuming others, and mortality itself, the terror and attraction of life that never ends. Finally, we'll consider the vampire's future. What will vampires mean in an age of climate crisis, artificial intelligence, pandemic, digital existence, and potential human enhancement? How will the myth adapt to context its creators couldn't have imagined? And what does the vampire's persistence, its refusal to die despite centuries of transformation, reveal about human nature and the stories we need to tell ourselves? What this book is and isn't. This is not an encyclopedia of vampire fiction. Such a project would be impossible. There are thousands of vampire novels, hundreds of films and television shows, countless comics and games. Instead, this book traces major evolutionary moments, the works and cultural shifts that transformed what vampires could be and mean. Some beloved vampire stories won't be discussed. Some obscure ones will be if they represent important transitions in the myth's development. This is also not primarily a work of literary criticism, though we touch on key texts. It's not folklore scholarship, though we examine folklore carefully. It's not film history, though we study important films. It's more of a cultural history, an examination of how a myth evolves, what makes it persist, why humans keep returning to this particular monster across centuries, cultures, and continents. This book treats vampires seriously without treating them preciously. The vampire is both ancient myth and commercial product, profound symbol and pulp entertainment, object of scholarly analysis and teenage obsession. All of these are real. All of these matter. We won't pretend that every vampire story is secretly profound, but we also won't dismiss vampire fiction as mere escapism. The stories we tell for fun often reveal more about our concerns than the ones we tell solemnly. The question of whether or not vampires are real is beside the point. The concerns vampires represent are very real indeed. Disease, death, predatory power, toxic desire, the fear of being consumed by forces stronger than ourselves. These are utterly real. The vampire gives them form, makes them narratable, turns abstract terror into stories we can tell and maybe even conquer. Understanding the vampire means understanding these underlying concerns and why we need supernatural metaphors to address them. Into the darkness. We stand now at a moment of vampire ubiquity. Vampires are everywhere. In bookstores and streaming queues, in video games and graphic novels, in serious literature and guilty pleasures. They've been analyzed by scholars, embraced by subcultures, commercialized by corporations, and parodied so thoroughly that parody itself has become a genre. The vampire has never been more familiar, more domesticated, more thoroughly incorporated into mainstream culture. And yet, the vampire retains its power. Even now, even after centuries of transformation and commercial exploitation, vampire stories can still unsettle and fascinate. We still use vampires to explore difficult questions about mortality, desire, power, and identity. We still find new meanings in this ancient myth, still discover new ways to tell vampire stories, still feel the pull of the creature that drinks life to preserve its own. This book is an invitation to look closely at that pull, to examine why the vampire fascinates us, to trace its evolution from folk belief to global phenomenon. We'll encounter bloated corpses in Serbian graves, aristocratic predators in Gothic novels, silent film nightmares and Hollywood icons, romantic heroes and tragic anti-heroes. We'll see how the vampire has been used to think about capitalism and disease, sex and immigration, technology and climate change. We'll watch the myth evolve while remaining essentially itself, always the dead that walk, always the predator that feeds, always the immortal that remembers. The vampire waits in the darkness as it always has. But darkness, as we'll discover, is where truths become visible that daylight obscures. The vampire shows us things about ourselves we might not otherwise see. Our capacity for predation, our fascination with death, our hunger for immortality, our terror of being consumed. It's a dark mirror showing distorted reflections, but distortion reveals truth that perfect reflection might hide. So let's step into the darkness. Let's follow the vampire from ancient graves to modern screens, from folk terror to literary sophistication, from village legends to global mythology. Let's see what this immortal creature, this persistent fantasy, This enduring fear reveals about the humans who created it, sustained it, and cannot seem to let it die. The vampire is waiting. It's been waiting for centuries, and it will wait for centuries more. Bloodlines, A History of Vampires, also available in Spanish as Linajes de Sangre, una historia de vampiros a través de los siglos y las culturas. Available in English and Spanish at Amazon in paperback, audiobook, and Kindle formats. Go get your copy and support your favorite writers and artists. Happy Halloween, everyone.